I'm Alan Levine, together with my colleague Tom Merrill. I run the Political Theory Institute, the sponsor of this evening's talk. We have one more event this semester. On November 30th, we have Diana Schaub speaking on Lincoln's Lyceum Address, Democratic Theory for Citizens. Tonight we have Tara Isabella Burton, who is a little outside of our normal wheelhouse, because in addition to being a proven scholar, she's also a novelist. She's the author of 3 novels: Social Creature, The World Cannot Give, and the forthcoming Here in Avalon. Her nonfiction works include Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, and the book that she'll be drawing on in her presentation today, Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Vinci to the Kardashians. Dr. Burton has written on religion and culture for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, among others, and she's currently a visiting fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She earned her BA, MST, and DPhil from Oxford University in England. So please join me in welcoming Tara Isabella Burton.
Thank you all so much for being here, for having me. I just had a wonderful conversation with some students who asked incredible questions. So I am so excited to kind of continue the conversation and contextualize some of those discussions. How am I in volume? Can you all hear me? All right, great. So I'd like to start this lecture by inviting you to consider one particular and particularly weird advertising campaign from January 2020 for the high-end boutique fitness chain Equinox. Now, it's produced by a marketing studio called Droga 5. The campaign was called Make Yourself a Gift to the World. And it featured a series of images devoted to the ideal gym goer as a kind of mythological sort of demigod of self-care. So one of the posters features this sort of powerful woman who's easily lifting up 2 men like biblical Samson. Another features a shirtless man lying on a funeral pyre attended by frenetic worshipers. Now, the purpose of this campaign, and I'm quoting the marketing firm here, was, quote, to depict divine characters as godlike gifts to the world in moments and situations that reflect their self-worship as serving a larger purpose to humanity. Asking the question, and this too is a quote, does that not make self-obsession the most selfless act of all? Or, as one Equinox chief marketer told the journalist, we're targeting individuals dedicated to becoming the very best they can be. Because, quote, when you become the best version of yourself, you radiate outward and contribute to the world around you. Now, Equinox is not exactly representative of real life. It's a gym whose prices start at $250 a month. They're famous for slightly transgressive and outre advertising campaigns. I believe it was this January that they banned members from joining in January on the grounds that if you weren't serious enough, they didn't want you if you were just a sort of New Year's Eve gym goer. Really good publicity for them. And I don't think they actually held to it. But I think that I like to use this example, and I use it at the top of my book, because I think it says something very particular about the way that we, or at least America in 2023, thinks about the self and the idea of the self transcending oneself for fun, for profit, for aesthetics. This idea that becoming the best version of yourself, conscious, sort of aesthetic and industrious self-cultivation, and sort of at the gym, you're sort of doing both, is a kind of process of becoming, in essence, a demigod. That it allows you to get in touch with some kind of mysterious and quasi-divine energy that a person can, as Equinox's marketing material state, radiate out into the world. This, I believe, and I argue this in my book, has become perhaps the dominant ethos of what you could call the civil religion of modernity. Something that, whether it's on subway advertisements or how we talk colloquially about good energy or bad energy or being your best self or becoming your best self, has become completely normalized in contemporary American life. And this interests me, and this is why I decided to explore it in Self-Made, because this was once a really fringe and esoteric view. Indeed, quite literally, some of this language has its roots in the Western esoteric tradition and in sort of bodies of work like the Corpus Hermetica. And now this somehow, from between, let's say, the Renaissance and the present day, the idea that we not only can, but indeed should make ourselves into gods, and that self-cultivation, self-defining who we are, who we want to be, and shaping that presentation to the outside world is the way in which we can best do that, has become, in a nutshell, the gospel of the religion of modernity. A gospel that has only proliferated more rapidly in the internet age, where anyone with a smartphone, that's 90% of Americans, can curate an entirely digital persona. Now, I think few people would deny that we live in an age of self-invention and self-curation, and some of this phenomenon is rooted in the availability of certain kinds of technology, the ease and availability of recording and documenting and sharing every aspects of our lives. Part of it is rooted in kind of new social practices. We're more likely, for example, to meet our partners online. And now a vast majority of American couples meet through dating sites, whether it's through the gig economy or the attention economy. Those of us who are freelancers, I'm sure, are familiar with the economic demand of self-creation. Indeed, about 16% of Americans work, at least in part, in the gig economy, and about a third of them work in whole or in part as freelancers. So the idea of self-promotion, self-creation, personal branding is an integral part of our contemporary economic life. But I believe that there's a bigger story at play here, a story that's not just about technology or about economics or about social change, but about the fundamental relationship between when I say our, I'm just gonna say America in 2023, cultural sense of the relationship between human beings and the divine. And I joke sometimes, I'm a theologian, and when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Obviously, I think that this is a theological story because that's why I'm a theologian. But I do think that there's something there. I think that we can think about self-making and personal branding and the call to self-curation as being downstream of a wider set of questions about the cultural role of our sense of ourselves as created beings, what a creator does or does not look like, who or what in this new metaphysical world can we think of as divine, as sacred, as holy, and where do we locate certain kinds of moral and creative authority? Is it out there in a creator God, or is it, as I believe increasingly has become the norm, in ourselves? So quick recap, what am I talking about when I talk about self-making? So there's sort of two paradigmatic cultural examples of a self-creator that I think many of you will be familiar with. The first is the paradigmatic self-made man, increasingly in history, the self-made person, who is a kind of entrepreneur who comes from nothing and pulls himself up by his bootstraps and makes money and makes a success of himself and kind of becomes self-made in that way. Thinking of Frederick Douglass, who indeed popularized the term self-made man in a lecture of the same name. There's Andrew Carnegie, so on and so forth, until the tech titans of today. The other paradigm of the self-maker is what I would call the dandy, the Beau Brummel or Oscar Wilde, people who have, for fun and profit, made their lives into works of art, who've shaped their public personae as kind of particular projects. Now, I think it's probably counterintuitive to say, or rather, it is counterintuitive to link these figures. What is the hardworking entrepreneur doing alongside the immaculately dressed dandy? But I actually see them as two sides of the same coin, two examples of this new way of thinking about the self, predicated on the idea that what is sacred, what is holy, what is the closest thing to divine in the world lies not just in the human creative potential or the human will, but human desire. That what we want defines us and makes us truly who we are. and that other elements of our lives, of ourselves, our circumstances, nature itself, these do not have fundamental meaning. They do not, they are raw materials for us to shape. And as I'll argue, there's sort of two different strains that the self-making narrative develops, the entrepreneur and the dandy. But ultimately, I think we are living in an era where these images have fused into one, where these two strains of dandy mythology have become a sort of Franken strain, so to speak. But I'll get to that in a bit. So I kind of want to leave you with 4 points, which I hope that I have timed this correctly, that I will get to all of them. But the first is this, that the story of self-creation I see as a story of self-divinization, the reimagining of the self as a kind of demigod who appropriates the divine act of creation. I want to argue too that this way of thinking is made possible by a phenomenon that I locate particularly in the Enlightenment, which is I call the disenchantment of custom. The idea that our social lives, our role in the social imaginary, is not God-given, sacred, or meaningful, but simply arbitrary and random, and therefore can be changed. 3, that, as I've already hinted, in the 19th century, these two different strains of self-creation narrative emerge. In Europe, we find the figure of the dandy more commonly. In America, we find the figure of the entrepreneur, but that they have more in common than might first appear, that they're both responses, I believe, attempts to find a kind of enchantment or sacredness in a world that is less likely to see the image of the church as being the repository of those things. And then finally, that in the 20th century, and particularly that through the celebrity culture of old Hollywood and in the birth of contemporary accounts of stardom, that these two strains finally become one. And the way that they become one is the idea that we are who we want to be. We truly are our desires, that they are the thing that makes us us. So, or as one of history's most notorious self-creators, the writer and dandy Oscar Wilde put it, give a man a mask and he will tell you the truth from another point of view. Gotta get Oscar Wilde in there. So before we get to these points, I want to just illustrate for contrast the world that came before. And a caveat, obviously, in a lecture like this is a simplification because all attempts to kind of reconstruct a historical mindset are a simplification. And I think we can talk about the pre-modern world in Europe, medieval Christendom, so to speak, as being defined by certain ideas about the self, God, and the self's relationship to God, and through it to the social imaginary. And the first is that the created self, who we are, created by God, is not just sort of our ideas or our minds or our hearts, but the totality of us, including our social selves, that God has ordained us king or peasant or priest to be in a particular social hierarchy, social order that reflects and is reflected by the natural order. We find this particularly in the 13th century philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, who sort of in his writings about natural law envisions the social order as a kind of mirror of the natural order. God has created us, and we exist really and fully in and through our relationship to this world that's a kind of cohesive whole. The second is that artistic creation and is not understood as a product of self-expression, but rather as a kind of way of providing glory to God. Historically, artists, particularly medieval artists, were anonymous, very rarely often working in fields or working collectively in the case of building cathedrals or other ecclesiastical art. And it was in fact so uncommon for art people to take credit for their work that there's actually a really funny case of 13th century Dominican monks who each claimed credit for the authorship of a text. And the church's response is to say, neither of you get it, it's published anonymously. The idea that the self could want credit for an artistic work is against the idea that work is for the glory of God. And all of this starts to change around the Renaissance. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to recap the social changes that are coming around this time. but I'm sure you're all familiar with many of these, the sort of rediscovery and interest of classical learning, the printing press, the industries, the development of certain kinds of cities and mercantile economies, so on, so forth. But it is the first time, particularly in Italy, that we see the kind of birth of a new class of people, a new kind of person. And we see some of these tensions play out in attempts to define them. And this is what I would call these self-made men. These are sometimes philosophers, humanists, artists, craftsmen who are born in largely middle-class circumstances, who through their work are leapfrogging the social ladder. Thinking here of Leonardo da Vinci is among the most famous examples, an illegitimate child. There's also Poggio Bracciolini, born a sort of penniless apothecary's son, Filippo Lippi. And there we start to see around this time the development of a kind of narrative that tries to figure out who these people are that don't quite fit. How do you account for these people who are leapfrogging the social order in a divinely ordained world? And I think that the tensions that come up in this conversation are really helpful for helping us contextualize what follows. So the way that the Renaissance genius, and the word genius it really sort of comes into play here, starts to be conceived of is basically half God, half man. Language about the genius, and we find this in like Vasari's accounts of Da Vinci as well as of Giotto and others, is that some people just have a special, innate, God-given ability that cannot be chosen or sort of worked for. It's just there. That makes them, in essence, bastard children of God. The language is often used of illegitimate parentage or of true parentage, that someone might be of humble birth legally on paper, but their real father is God, their real father is nature, their real father is fortune. This language is really common. There's a wonderful, the scholar Albert Rathel has a wonderful compendium of texts of true nobility. The phrase is really common in the 15th century, as there's a number of dialogues and treatises and manifestos all investigating this mysterious true noble, this genius. He's not, and it's still he is not an aristocrat of blood, but he's a kind of special aristocrat who is, in some sense, divine. Now, what I find really interesting is that, and I joke about this a lot, every time you find a conception of innate, divine, magical genius, within roughly the same time frame, you find a self-help manifesto about how to get it. And around the same time that we have this image of the divine Renaissance genius, we also have what I like to call one of the first great self-help books, Baldassare Castiglione's 1528 Book of the Courtier, which encourages would-be courtiers to essentially fake it to make it to look like a genius. So this concept of sprezzatura, which is Italian and arguably untranslatable, means something like lightness, effortlessness, nonchalance, I think it just sounds better in Italian. But the idea is that by making something look effortless, by not appearing to try hard, you are able to suggest that you might, in fact, be one of these favored and divine geniuses. And this tension is something that we see constantly recurring throughout the idea of the special person, the self-maker. Are they magical, innate beings who have something special that cannot be replicated by the ordinary person? Or is genius, or the perception of genius, something that can be created through wily human effort? So I want to sort of foreground, as we go later into the history, these tensions between both the sense of innate or earned, but also the sense of what makes the genius a genius, what makes him tick, so to speak. So even in the Renaissance, we do actually find some figures whose views of true nobility are a little more radical and less orthodox than the sort of the divine bastard. So who are more willing to suggest that there is something innate in human nature that could allow anyone to self-fashion. My favorite example here is the humanist and philosopher and sometimes Kabbalist and sometimes occultist and sometimes many other things, Pico della Mirandola. And in his 1509 Oration on the Dignity of Man, he basically retells the story of Genesis in a slightly heretical and rather transgressive way. Basically, God uses up all of his energy and strength in the first 6 days of creation. He gets to man, isn't sure what to do, and basically does not have any, it's a sort of Neoplatonic idea of seeds, but he has no seeds left. So he does not give man a purpose. And I'm quoting Mirandola here. Adam, God announces, you have been given no fixed place, no form of your own, so that you may have and possess according to your will and your inclination, whatever place, whatever form, and whatever functions you choose. Divine law assigns to all other creatures a fixed nature, but you, constrained by no laws, by your own free will, in whose hands I have placed you, will determine your own nature. Now, I think he might be the sort of best example, quite presciently, of, I think, a mentality that ultimately comes, I believe, to be dominant. This idea that whatever nature we have is for us to decide. Our will and our wanting form us and make us who we are. And it's to me really striking that this is bound up with the idea of a kind of a God a limited God, a God whose power runs out at the moment of the creation of humanity. You know, God exists in the story, but God is not omnipotent. God is given over certain powers to man, and that ultimately will become the foundational narrative of the self-making ideology. So I told you earlier about this idea of the disenchantment of custom, and what I would argue that in the Renaissance, in these tensions, we would see a kind of vision of a world that's still enchanted. The self-maker, the genius, is an exception to the rules, but he's an exception that proves the rule. There's a place for him. That starts changing in, and again, reductionist as all historical accounts must be, but in the Enlightenment. And I think the Enlightenment is often sort of described in a shorthand as it's about reason, and then Romanticism about emotions. For a variety of reasons I won't get into here, I don't think that's the most fair characterization. I think the way to talk about the European Enlightenment is as a period focusing on the autonomous self versus the communal or custom-based self, the idea that becomes sort of central to so much Enlightenment thought is the idea that there's a kind of earlier stage of humanity, led by leading strings, as Kant famously said, that is sort of taught what to think, and that certain kinds of intellectual maturity come by independence, isolation, and autonomy. And it's around this time that we see the word custom basically become a dirty word, a way of describing the social imaginary, the social order, not as something God-given or divinely ordained, but simply kind of arbitrary and random and subject to change. We find this, for example, in the 18th century French philosopher Diderot. He writes a letter to his Scottish contemporary David Hume, approvingly assuring him that you belong to all nations, and you will never ask an unfortunate person for an extract from his baptismal register. Information, in other words, about his place of birth. So this idea that sort of your rootedness, where you were born, these situational facts about your life, those aren't really you. They're just, Montaigne uses the example of sort of borrowed fashion and clothing. There are things you can put on, and there are things you can take off. A huge genre around this time is that of the traveler's tale, where we have Diderot writes one, Montesquieu writes one, there's plenty of others, where either Europeans go to the so-called New World, or there are sort of representatives from non-Western cultures who come to Europe, and they're struck by the fact that, wow, people do things differently here. People do things differently there. And these texts are generally used to poke fun at the Catholic Church. They're used to poke fun at various establishments. But the kind of point of them is to emphasize this fact that our social roles are changeable. They're malleable. Whatever makes us really us, whatever we decide has to be something separate from our circumstance and our rootedness, for better and for worse. So this idea that basically there is no enchantment in our social lives, that this exists as raw material for us to choose, starts to take on two different forms in the 19th century. Generally speaking, in Europe, this comes in the model of the figure of the dandy. And what's interesting is despite the fact that I think many people who have heard of Oscar Wilde as a sort of queer icon might think of the dandy as a bit transgressive, there's actually something really reactionary about the figure of the dandy. From Beau Brummel, the sort of Regency era, basically the first influencer, onwards to Wilde. There's a sense that the dandy has some quality, in Regency England it's called bon ton, another untranslatable term, this time from French, but basically means elegance or grace, that is not reducible either to birth or to money. In this sort of rapidly industrializing time where we see this rapid rise of the middle class, the dandy becomes a kind of liminal figure who is neither blood aristocrat, nor is he sort of arriviste new money. He has something special and irreproducible about him that makes him simply better than other people. There's a kind of aristocracy of style about him. One sort of theorist of dandyism, Honoré de Balzac, who in 1830 wrote a treatise on elegant living, has a character mournfully harkened back to sort of this world of the social imaginary that has been lost in the rising tide of democracy. And he says, the moment that two books of parchment, he's referring to the Bible, no longer stand for everything, where the natural son of a millionaire bath attendant and the man of talent have the same rights as the son of a count, we can no longer be distinguished by anything but our intrinsic value. And the search for intrinsic value becomes very formative for this particular ideal of the dandy, the idea that there's some people who are innately better than others, who have something about them. They have, later in Hollywood, this will be called it, a quality that makes them able to shape their own lives, their own circumstances, their aesthetic presentation, and that sets them apart from the mere crowd, the sheeple, you might say in contemporary parlance, who are simply imitators. And the apex of this vision, I argue, can be found not necessarily in the Wildean dandy, but actually in a different cultural figure of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch. And Nietzsche was explicit in seeing this vision of the self as a theological one. The self is in a world where, as he famously says, God is dead, where religious values have no meaning. The meaning is only created by someone who is strong enough to impose his will on the world, who is able to shape and create the world in his image. There's this sense where this vision of the aristocracy of style of dandyism gives way to a sense of the natural aristocrat, the aristocrat of the soul, the Übermensch. This is taken up in the 20th century politically, particularly by a number of fascists, Hitler, of course, but also perhaps more explicitly in terms of this vision of dandyism, Gabriele D'Annunzio, an Italian proto-fascist, very involved in a very complicated endeavor that I will not explain here, and better known, Benito Mussolini, who saw Italian fascism as this sort of aesthetic culmination of this vision of our natural aristocracy. So that's one sort of strain of the story, the artistic creator of the self who is just plain better than other people, who has a certain ability to kind of create artistic meaning to his own life and to the life of people around him by imposing his will on others. And this is fundamentally, I think, a kind of bleakly nihilistic vision of the world. It's a vision where nothing has any meaning but what we impose upon it. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But meanwhile, across the pond in America, a different, though I will argue in many ways less different than it would appear, story starts to play out. We have sort of deep in the American cultural consciousness from the late 18th century onwards, there is a sense of self-making as a a moral good and a moral duty, that self-cultivation, self-creation is a political act. To put it simplistically, how can we govern ourselves? How can we govern ourselves politically if we could not govern ourselves personally? We find this, for example, in the writings of Benjamin Franklin. We find this perhaps most clearly elucidated in the writings of Frederick Douglass, whose vision of the self-made man was a celebration of American opportunity. He talks about in old Europe, you were who your fathers were, but and again, repeating the sort of motive of sonship that was also so common in sort of Renaissance accounts of self-creation. In America, you have to prove yourself to be the metaphorical, to be the son of Lincoln, to be the son of Henry Clay. It's not to be the literal biological son, but to prove yourself in this kind of descent and lineage of greatness. And this image of self-creation as a moral duty initially does not necessarily linked to financial success up to a point. There's sort of a middle-class lifestyle that is perhaps ideal, but ultimately the paradigmatic self-made man is a virtuous citizen, not an entrepreneur. And around this time, we actually see the publication of a number of sort of secular hagiographies of self-made men. There's Emerson's Representative Men. There's Charles Seymour's Self-Made Men, 1858. Even Harriet Beecher Stowe actually wrote 2, Men of Our Times in 1868, and The Lives and Deeds of Our Self-Made Men in 1872. And importantly, almost none of these men listed were entrepreneurs or particularly wealthy. Douglass features a lot, Lincoln features a lot, but they are sort of righteous, sober men who work hard and are industrious citizens and models of good living. But all of that starts to change after the Civil War. And increasingly, the narrative of self-making becomes not just about making a lot of money, but about sort of controlling or harnessing the energies of the world. There becomes a kind of re-enchantment of the world through this vision of the self-maker who can somehow harness the power, or you might even say in modern parlance, the vibes of the world. So this starts around roughly in the late 19th century in times of enormous wealth inequality, as increasingly the men celebrated as self-makers are billionaires, magnates like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Roland H. Macy. And increasingly the narrative of what it means to be a self-made man, it ends up not being just about hard work, but about ability to harness a particular power. And this power is coded in various ways and quite frankly, quite pseudo-scientific terms as being a power that's a bit like electricity. It's a bit like magnetism. It's often language of evolution and natural selection are used as well. But there's a sort of prevailing sense in self-help books at the time that there is some kind of secret energy that is flowing through the world, and that the good self-maker, the effective self-maker, is able to look within himself, harness that energy, and channel it towards success. Now, the most extreme, but I think representative example of this phenomenon is something called New Thought, which I genuinely, I have argued is perhaps the most underrated cultural force in contemporary American life. And New Thought has a genesis in the 1860s. It is with a faith healer named Phineas Quimby, who basically comes to believe that faith healing only works on some of his patients because only some of his patients want to get better. That there are the difference between someone who gets sick and someone who gets well is personal desire. So originally this is just applied to becomes a well-known faith healer or New Thought healer, but his followers take up this mantle and end up writing and publishing works of New Thought directed not just to health, but to financial success. The idea that basically if you think really positive, if you just plain want it badly enough, good things will happen to you. You will grow rich. And in this time of enormous wealth inequality, this is seen as a kind of legitimization of the way things are. To quote one popular New Thought self-help book by James Allen, None is shut out from the banquet, except he who wishes to be. That if people are poor, if people are sick, it is simply their own fault. And this sort of puts in a slightly different cast on the self-making story. Because on the one hand, unlike in the European model, anyone conceivably can become a self-maker. Anyone conceivably can control his own life. But if you haven't, it means that you've done something wrong, that you have failed. And this sort of moral element of self-making is something that everyone should do, but only some do, in fact, manage to do, ends up being kind of an odd mirror image of this European model. One is, it's just innate. Some people are simply better than others. The other one kind of winds up similarly. Some people are simply better than others. But it's, again, you can see that there's obviously differences in the kind of emphasis of both of these cultural figures, but both of them ultimately come down to the same place with different emphases, which is that the world is not a meaningful place except through human will and human desire. If there is anything divine or enchanted in the world at all, it comes from our ability to look within ourselves, to channel what we want into action. So ultimately, these two narratives, the innate narrative and the you just have to work harder and want it more narrative, I believe, converge. And they, I would argue, converge in old Hollywood and really the sort of celebrity culture that springs up there and kind of gets intensified throughout the 20th century with the development of television and later the internet, which is this idea that whatever this innate quality is, whatever this thing that makes the great self-makers, at this point in Hollywood, it's known as It, which is starts as a short story about mysterious quality that gets optioned by Paramount and made into a movie with Clara Bow, the first It Girl, which is about a girl who has it. And the idea is that there's just, it can sort of be had if you, or it can sort of be attained and it's sort of innate. And the way that this tension is sort of reconciled in the tradition of New Thought is the way that you know you have it is if you want it badly enough. That it is something that you can harness, that you can control. So again, this is the time of a real rise of advertising. And so this idea that it can maybe you have it, maybe you don't, but you could get it if you bought the right products, if you did the right things, starts to come into public consciousness and be normalized. And but I think for me, the ultimate paradigmatic example of this comes in a 1928 advertisement for a self-help course. And it is it's being advertised in a magazine that's called Personal Magnetism. And it's basically a course saying, you too can have it if you pay however many dollars and send in your name and what have you. If you pay for it, you can have it. But the way that it presents it is that if you are simply willing to pay for it, if you are able to show that you want it badly enough, it means that you have it. So the advertisement reads, you have it. Everyone has it, but not one person in 1,000 knows how to use it. So what separates the star, the sort of the superior person from the ordinary person is their ability to act on their desire, to want it badly enough and go get it. And throughout the 20th century, it's precisely that narrative that becomes ascendant as the studio system of old Hollywood basically collapses, as new media, particularly television, democratize the process of recording and celebrity self-making. This idea that you just have to want it badly enough and wanting it makes it true becomes more and more a part of star culture. But you find this sort of reaching a particular new and even more intense moment in the factory set of Andy Warhol. Infamously, Jackie Curtis, one of the it girls, Warhol sort of handpicked superstars, has this poem where she sort of celebrates her own, and she's I think would now be referred to as genderqueer. She just play with her gender identity every day, appearing one day as a man, one day as a woman, and wrote this poem about this particular creative power, in which she says, "It is the work one does himself, my mother told me, and not what is handed to him ready-made, that has that constructive power." Another one of Warhol's contemporaries, describing life in the factory, said, basically, if you wanted to be an artist, you basically just said you were. Like with punk, if you wanted to be a musician, you really didn't have to learn how to play an instrument. And I believe that is precisely that idea, that what we want is more constitutive of who we are, that our desires, rather than our circumstances, our custom, define us, has become kind of central to this narrative of self-making that fuses together the idea that some people are simply a little bit better than others, or some people have a particular kind of star power, but that star power is something you can attain if you simply want it badly enough, if you simply try hard enough. And I think sometimes I think we sort of have the worst of all worlds, because we have the moral condemnation of those who fail, that is so much a part of the democratic American narrative, and yet the sort of sense of a certain kind of hierarchy of stardom that we have with the European aristocratic narrative. But nevertheless, now in an era where all of us, or at least many of us, are encouraged, if not required, to create ourselves, both for aesthetic reasons and for professional reasons, that we're meant to personally provide ourselves with personal brands. This sense that self-making is at the heart of our ideology, at the heart of what we ought to be doing, has become more and more paramount. There's this incredible pressure to live our best lives. Right now, influencing is a $13.8 billion industry. 75% of American brands now budget separately for influencer marketing. So clearly this idea that there's a kind of influencer culture that more and more people are not only drawn to, but cannot escape from, has kind of inculcated our cultural consciousness. And I think it would be too simplistic to sort of draw a straight line from Da Vinci all the way to the Kardashians, say. But I think that there is something to the fact that this disenchantment of circumstance, this disenchantment of custom, this idea that who we really are can be found, our authentic selves can be found in what we want rather than our communal and social relations, is a huge part of the story of self-making. In a 2015 interview, a biographer of the Marquis de Sade, one of the Enlightenment's most controversial figures, was marveled at the de Sade's influence on the revolutionary French student movements of 1968. "I looked at all the placards reading, 'It is forbidden to forbid,' and 'do whatever you desire,'" the interviewer said. "And I suddenly understood that all our revolutionary phrases were actually from Sade." Now, that's probably an overstatement of the case, but I think that we can, in fact, see a sense that our desires are not something to be restricted or to be socially repressed, but to be celebrated, has increasingly become more and more normalized in contemporary life. And that is not to say, and I want to be very careful about this, that I see this as some kind of a great tragedy, that things were so much better in medieval Christendom and it's all been downhill from here. I don't think that at all. But I do think that as we think about the kind of promise and the potential of self-making, of Douglas's revolutionary vision of human freedom and human ingenuity and freedom from certain kinds of oppressive social systems, that we also think that perhaps we have lost sight of the idea that other things make us who we are, that things that we do not choose make us who we are, our families, our communities, our social relations and bonds to one another. So I always like to conclude any conversation about self-made with the idea that, there's perhaps nothing more fundamentally human in negotiating what makes us us than this question of what parts of us are chosen and what parts of us are not, what parts of the elements of who we really are about freedom and which are about contending with facticity. And this is not a new question. Shakespeare's Hamlet around 1600 marvels what a piece of work is a man. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, and at the same time, he is nothing but a quintessence of dust. More than 400 years later, we're still wrestling with Hamlet's contradictions, asking ourselves what it means to be our true self. Anyway, thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. It is our tradition to take student questions first.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, so I'll let you decide who's a student.
Oh my goodness, the pressure's on. Don't know anyone's names. Show of hands. Yes.
Do you believe that our desires and what we want have been effectively ruined or distorted by how commercialized society is nowadays? Like people who want the new iPhone, that's a product, that's a thing, something that people buy. Are our desires muddled or ruined as a result of commercial?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and I completely think there are. I think if I have an objection to the ideas that our desires make us who we are, it's because I am wary of the notion that there is anything authentic in what we want, precisely because what we want is so often so shaped by the world around us, by other people, by advertisements, by stories, by myths. I don't think that there is such a thing as authentic or true or innate desire. And so the idea that somehow we are our most authentic selves when following what we want only leads us to a certain other kind of perhaps imitation. Yes.
Generally speaking, how would you say this connects to like modern feminism? Like I read some of Simone de Beauvoir and like her theories of existentialism, and I'm kind of seeing like a kind of a parallel in this, like how we treat ourselves as such innate beings, and then how this would connect to feminism and treating and how women see themselves as kind of like standing away from men.
Sure. I think that what's interesting about sort of the history of the narrative of dandyism, particularly, and in the self-making tradition. So obviously, the self-making tradition is generally one that historically is sort of open only to men, but for a variety of historical reasons. But within specifically the dandyist idea of self-making, there's a real strong misogynist streak where women are associated with nature and a kind of meaningless, like empty void nature, not a powerful, like enchanted goddess nature, just sort of there's lines in Joris Calquis-Moll's novel Against Nature about nature is a desiccated old crone, and so there's a kind of odd treatment of the feminine as linked up with a kind of meaningless natural, which either has to be conquered, subdued, formed, shaped, but there's a particular and rather striking disregard for female self-creation. One of the most striking things about a lot of these dandies who themselves, many of which sort of played with gender and were quite sort of willing to experiment with androgyny themselves, often some of their worst ire is reserved for women who try to do the same thing. The idea that like Baudelaire has multiple stories and sort of poems about women who put on makeup, and somehow they're doing this sort of bourgeois thing where they're, to use a common term, like putting lipstick on a pig. They're trying to create something artificial, but they can't, and their horrible naturalness shows through. And that specifically, it is only the dandy who stands above nature and is, almost always male. There's the only one of the few female dandies, Rachilde, sort of adopted male drag for the variety of her sort of social and professional life. And so there's a sort of sort of self-creation, at least until the old Hollywood era, is very tied up with the idea of a masculine control over nature. If that is relevant.
Yeah.
Or do you want to ask
And
about?
also, like kind of correlates with kind of fashion in a sense, because like as you were talking about like the 1860s and 1830s and how like kind of, I don't know, it's kind of off topic, but like waistlines became slimmer and dresses became slimmer. And when you said in old Hollywood, like the flapper style was very like man oriented. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a sort of particular and something that's sort of almost uniformly true, at least in the dandiest strain, is that both sort of gender bending and images of sexual non-normativity are used rhetorically. Which say many dandies were gay, but this is sort of a separate phenomenon, or perhaps you could say a related phenomenon, which is that the kind of imagery of being above quote unquote normal sexual desire, either by being sexually free and you're practicing free love, or having sort of gay relationships, but this was sort of part of a public performance to say, I'm not like you, boring bourgeois, you just have boring married sex and it's terrible. I am somehow above this and free. You find this even in like another of the sort of great bastards of literature, who's also sort of a bit of a self-maker, but a villainous one, which is Edmund in King Lear, who sort of contrasts his own conception as a bastard full of heat and lust and sex, and the boring married sex that his legitimate brother is conceived in the marriage bed. You find this also in the Marquis de Sade, and then you find this in Brummel in various ways, although Brummel's whole thing was being above sex altogether. And so on, and you find this in sort of the gender bending of many of the stars of Andy Warhol's Factory, some of whom would have understood themselves as transgender women today, or we think they would have understood themselves, some of whom were very explicit about like, gender is something I play with, and I just want this to be something that I'm sort of constantly reinventing every day, and it's part of a rhetorical move. Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh.
I was really fascinated by the idea of what we want actually constitutes who we are, and can determine that way more than any other factor. And I wanted to kind of think about how we are able to determine what we want in the age of social media. It kind of harkening back to an earlier question. If there is some kind of insidious control that is imposed by social media controlling how we determine what we want, and contrasting that with the freedom that came with kind of playing around with different aspects of your identity within these movements that you talk about, and or if you view there as being a contrast between the freedom of that versus the control that social media has over the information we get to determine what we want, even in today's time.
Yeah, those are great questions.
For the video, could you repeat the question?
Oh, let's see. How do we sort of square the circle of the certain kind of vision of playfulness and freedom that sort of a certain idea of particularly the dandy might have in experimenting with who one is, with the sort of sense that what we want might be controlled by social media, and that our desires are kind of shaped by this wider panopticon that we are all increasingly subject to. Is that a fair summation, your question? Great. Well, so I have two answers to that. And one is to say, I think that there is something, perhaps the best, as speaking sort of editorializing here, but the best of the vision of the dandy. I got into this project because as a teenager, I really liked Oscar Wilde. And I think that there is something really beautiful about the dandiest ideal of irreproducibility, that in an age of sort of mass production and mechanical reproduction and rapid industrialization and urbanization, and a time where everything is changing and nothing is certain, that there's a kind of affirmation on the part of the aesthetic self-creator that I am me. I am not, I'm a machine. There's a sort of whole cultural anxiety about robots and women who are robots and prostitutes who are secretly robots. Like the android is a sort of source of, is the opposite of the dandy, the reproducible being, usually female. And I think that, but leaving the kind of weird misogyny aside, I think that there is something to the idea that we want to assert ourselves, our originality, our usness, and that this is something that should be preserved in any sort of account of what it means to be human, that we want to disclose ourselves as fully individual beings. And I think that what I find really striking about contemporary influencer culture, even as it kind of keeps up this notion of self-creation and self-curation, is that while the tools of self-creation have been democratized, again, 90% of Americans now have a smartphone, the idea that like it is now so straightforwardly commercial and commodifiable, and you know exactly how much money you might be making by exactly how many followers or likes you have, that I think that like the most important thing to preserve perhaps from the dandiest tradition is something that is being lost. But my second answer to your question is that, again, I'm sort of wary of thinking that there really is such a thing as a total human freedom, that it is always ever illusory. I think there is sort of a rich tradition in literature of the fact that human beings, we lie to ourselves. We lie to ourselves a lot. We can't really trust what we want. We can't trust what we think. We can't trust what we know. And I think that this idea, this ideal of someone who is completely free to act in accordance with their own desires is in fact a bit illusory. It is only ever an ideal.
Well, obviously there are counter trends, right? And I can think of lots and lots of novels and movies for that matter that take people who try to be self-made and critique it, like Moby Dick comes to mind. You know,
Yeah.
Ahab, if he's not a self-creator, who is? And the book is really not set him up as a good model for, you know, young men or young women to follow. So there's obviously some counter trend and lots of it in literature. So where do you think all that comes from? The critique of it. What's that tradition?
I don't think that there's ever that it's ever sort of any cultural story could be straightforward and linear. And I think that particularly in the United States, where self-creation is so held up as a kind of stated model, there is and will sort of always remain a sense of deep unease with what that means, with sort of what it means to be a limited human being. I think that simultaneously that there, you know, this is always a story of a pendulum, that there's always a push and pull, but that as much as I love Moby Dick and perhaps wish its lessons were better heeded, that the age of the internet has propelled us into a kind of new level in this pendulum shift. Perhaps it's a point of no return, where the ease of certain kinds of self-creation, the fact that we are no longer, for large parts of our professional lives, our personal lives, tethered to our bodies, makes it all the sort of easier to project, not simply to project who one wants to project, but to live in a landscape that quite literally runs on desire, that the attention economy, as well as sort of what we literally see when we look into our computer screens and see the algorithms that are provided for us and the sort of ads that are provided for us because we clicked on those things, we are seeing worlds, realities of our own making. And so I think that it's a high time that we do have literature that critiques this. I think my novels hope to do that, although I would never claim to be anything close to novel. But I think that this is we are in a new and rather frightening age. And I will say that in the pandemic, I was originally a sort of cultural optimist about the post-pandemic world. I thought, you know, we're all going to be stuck to our screens for a couple of years, and then we come out, we're going to really want to move away from that there's going to be a cultural shift towards certain kinds of givenness, certain kinds of mutuality, certain kinds of community. Anecdotally, and maybe it's too soon to tell, I feel like the reverse has happened, that the kind of mimetic internet culture that existed before the pandemic has only gotten more intense. But I feel like it's too soon to make a definitive announcement on that, or a definitive projection.
You have talked about self made, but there is a difference that I'm not sensing, and perhaps you can address it, between the reality and the appearance of self. Because one of the problems with, frankly, modernity in general, let's just say it's since the Enlightenment, never mind, there's not just one
Yeah,
enlightenment,
yeah,
we'll leave
sure.
that aside, perhaps. The idea that we appear a certain way, of course, that is manipulable. But what about the real deal? When you mentioned Franklin, for example, oh, he was a master at changing his appearance. But this man, just like George Washington, was working on his real self. And not just to be, cool, but when he wrote his journal, and even more obviously for George Washington, these people were interested in fashioning themselves in the best way possible, not from the sense of, well, what's gonna fly out there, because the audience for the real self is different from the audience from the appearance self. George Washington could, do his I've said enough. So yeah, this is I dare say, a rather huge difference.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. But I think that what I would argue is happening is that the sort of I make no claims about the real self, but I'd say perhaps a cultural sense of what the self is has sufficiently shifted since Franklin and Douglas, for that matter, for these sort of prophets of a certain virtue, ethics, motivated vision of the self, towards what I think of as a fundamentally nihilistic view that reality itself is malleable. So the way that I would frame it, both, and I think you can see this both in particular, like particularly the Italian fascist tradition, but the kind of sort of political aesthetic fascism more broadly, but also in the American New Thought version of this, you kind of get to the same, I believe, account of reality, which is that the power lies in shaping people's perceptions because perceptions are reality. And I think if you don't have a robust sense of the real, of the world as kind of having any particular moral significance or metaphysical significance, where everything is raw material, then reality is what you say it is. And so I think that it's not that I am denying a difference between the real self and the appearance self at all, but that I think that increasingly the sort of proliferation of the idea that our appearance self is the real self precisely because there is no reality anywhere but perception. And I think in the Twitter age in particular, that's become an even more sort of frenetic problem. I am very concerned about the loss of the real self. And I think what you say about the audience of the real self is extremely important, and I want to highlight it. Someone asked me once, what's the best antidote towards this vision of self-making? And my answer is friendship, real friendship, precisely because it is a relationship of affinity. It's a political relationship. It is not simply sort of familiar. In some senses, you can say it's circumstance, but it's not. It's also a little chosen. But it's precisely in the relationship between two friends who hold each other accountable, who see each other choice. One might say choice and givenness alike. That I think a kind of real self-development, self-cultivation might take place. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about friendship as well.
Thank you for that. That's very important.
Can I follow up on that?
Sure.
It seems to me that what's in the background of the story you're telling is just a change of attitude towards truth.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And at one point in time, people believed that something was true. Whether their belief about what was true or not,
Yeah.
that's a separate thing. But they believed that something was true, and therefore that created limits to how they could create themselves. And now in our society, we don't really believe that there's any truth out there. There's no objective truth, and that frees us up to do whatever we want.
Absolutely, you got it on. I want to tell a story. Last week I was at a talk, and one of the people who asked a question said something like, "Oh yeah, I mean, one could." Too close to the microphone. Sorry. One could, isn't it silly that people like used to believe? Like, we obviously know that there's no such thing as transcendent truth, and this is just like completely self-evident. And he sort of went on this long question about something unrelated, but predicated on the idea that it was like patently silly that anyone might think of truth as something that is true out there. So we can't look up and see truth. And it was so interesting to me, not that he thought that, because I mean, that is a position one could hold, but that it didn't even occur to him that this was like not necessarily historically the most that it struck me how obvious this was to him, and how he didn't even take a moment to say, this is of you among others. It was just self-evident. And I thought that's really striking. And this is, when I think that this is not simply a sort of religion versus disaffiliated or religious nuns question. I think that regardless of religious affiliation, we're all sort of breathing in the miasma of this cultural phenomenon, that whatever we might think we believe, I think that this is a sort of the idea that there's no such thing as truth. Truth is what you make it. Alternative facts, which now is I feel like a really dated reference onwards. This sense that just truth is what you make it, and I think you can only think that truth is what you make it if you don't have a robust ontological account of truth as something that exists.
And so if I can just ask one more. So I was struck that insofar as the truth is sort of in the background, I was struck that when you talk about what you want to do about it, you talk about relationships with your family, with a friend, which I understand to be, okay, there's some kind of someone who's going to tell you the truth, right, about yourself, maybe that you don't want to hear or don't want to see. Why do you emphasize that, the human relationships, as opposed to
I mean, I think everyone should also study. Oh gosh, I think everyone should also study philosophy. I think both of those things are good, but I think that actually, like, one of the best ways to understand ourselves as the kind of beings that we are, which is to mean the kind of beings who, again, I'm editorializing, I apologize, but exist in community, understand ourselves in community, is to do philosophy in community. And part of doing philosophy in community is having conversation like this one. And part of it is having relationships of friendship, other forms of relationship, where we are able to both see ourselves reflected back at us, but also, I think, transform in our actions towards other people. I think I'm a sort of sappy enough to think that love and attention are real truthful forces that can transform us towards a sense of what is good. And so I think it's not that I object to doing philosophy or doing science or any form of intellectual inquiry, but that I think that the idea that those forms of intellectual inquiry should be done autonomously or in isolation actually risk putting us back into a post-enlightenment track I want to resist.
Yes.
Sure.
So I guess my big question is, I'm interested in what you think the self-made trend or tradition, or however you think about it, what effects it has on politics, whether it's good for politics or bad for politics. So that's the big question. But I have another, perhaps less fair question, and which is part of it, because I don't know if you know the thing I'm about to ask about. I'm interested in the phenomena of Bronze Age pervert. And
yes,
the right-wing bodybuilding, sort of alt-right, like amazingly unpolitically correct, that's a terrible way to even put it. But I wonder if you could just talk about what's happening to our culture at the moment. Why do we feel so unhappy if we're self-making in a positive way?
Why does he feel so unhappy?
Why do we as a culture feel so unhappy?
So I think actually Bronze Age pervert and what I sort of for those who don't know, I'm so happy for you. Extremely online, a pseudonym of extremely online, far right, sort of Genesis vitalist, neo-Nietzschean, who became increasingly well-known, sort of from 2016 onwards. And I think he's representative of this sort of neo-Nietzschean, neo-vitalist trend that's simultaneously trying to reject certain visions of, human freedom and equality, and also very much return to perhaps the more aristocratic vision of the self-makers. There are these people who are simply innately better. A big part of the sort of vitalist ideology, which is sort of very much downstream of a certain reading of Nietzsche, is this idea that, again, there are hierarchies, and somehow in this modern liberal democratic world, we have lost sight of them. And now the most charitable thing I can say about Project Pervert, and there are really not many charitable things, but I can say I can see why there might be a cultural hunger for trying to find elements of who we are that we do not choose, a sort of sense of givenness, a sense of rootedness. These are not crazy things to want in and of themselves, but I think that that he is able to channel the sort of disaffection and hunger and sense of alienation of a lot of people who are looking for community and family and a sense of meaning, and maybe even a sense that there is some transcendent truth out there, and turns it into the transcendent truth is basically, it's a dog eat dog world and some people are at the top of it, and maybe if you take it, body build hard enough, that can be you. And I think that he, like Mussolini, like D'Annunzio, like many sort of aesthetic reactionary people in the fascist tradition, basically are able to sell a fantasy that is, and I mean, actually you could say this is also sort of true of the American version, that there's always the fantasy that you are one of the good ones, that you are one of the strong ones, you are one of the, you are not a sheeple, you are not an NPC on Twitter, you are a real live person. Being able to sell, like, he's been very effective at peddling that fantasy to people who I hope in other circumstances might not be drawn to his particular brand of politics. Thanks.
So I have a question, but I want to draw a connection between the past few questions and comments, and this is just in the background of what you were saying, and that is that to the extent that the self is self-created, it means that prior to the self-creation, and maybe even through it, there's no external reference, which has led to a kind of intense narcissism, in which people try to create themselves, but they can't really be sure that what they're creating is the thing to create, and so they need attention for it. And you said that the attention economy, and that seems closely related to the unhappiness that we see in the suffer. I mean, it seems like somebody who is creating a work of art, like Vinci, is doing something fundamentally different from somebody who's trying to to be maximally online, to get maximal likes. And that arc is very interesting, the way in which the person who creates himself because he has an idea of what a self is and what he or she wants to be. And so in that sense, it's elevated to a kind of independence from the crowd, rather than being sort of abjectly dependent on the crowd. But that abject dependence seems to really strike me.
Absolutely. So two answers to your point. I think the first is that I think what I find so interesting about the idea of the attention economy is precisely because, and I think it's Simone Weil who writes about attention being the deepest form of love, that there is a kind of hunger for a certain kind of recognition of oneself as oneself that I think is very much at the core of who we are. And I think it's precisely because in many cases we don't necessarily know how to be seen. We don't know how to be seen as oneself, and maybe we don't even know how to be recognized. If we are seen as oneself, what that even means, how would we know it if someone did? But I think that this, we can talk about the purely economic aspects of the attention economy, which are, bearing our souls is now profitable because people want to see, for myriad of reasons, other people bearing their souls. But also I think that, I'm guilty of it too. Every time I, find myself tweeting about my new book or, putting up an Instagram post about something I'm doing professionally, I wait for those likes and I get a little dopamine hit. And it's even, going and talking about how bad it is, I still find myself doing it. And I'm very conscious of, I think I can only hope that there is some way of living or some way of ordering one's soul to not need that kind of attention, or to be able to have in one's actual life interactions of giving attention and being attended to that are not warped by sort of the simulacrum of it. But I think that one of the reasons that the attention economy works is because, it is to be quite bold about it, it's a perversion of something that is sort of true and good in us, which is that attention is generally a thing that we want for good reasons. And I'm so sorry, I've now forgotten the second half of your question.
But so not surprisingly, Tocqueville talks about this, since he talks about everything. Having to do with our deepest selves. When he talks about the loss of primogeniture and more things are up in the air and more things are and people can actually change where they are in society. And so suddenly more than Europeans, Americans are faced with this combination of opportunity. They can be something that they weren't yesterday or that their fathers and mothers weren't, but they have no sense of who they are. There's much less of the given. And the way that that's rooted not only culturally but economically. But that makes me think of something else. And that is because you asked these questions in reference to the notion of divinity. And it made me wonder, what's the notion of divinity in Lady Gaga or whatever the self-made people that we might put as examples. And I wanted to, is it pantheism, going back to the
I think it's closer to that than anything else. I think I'll jokingly refer to it as a religion of vibes. But I think there's something to it. And I think this is where the New Thought connection and the kind of 19th century sort of spiritualized obsession with electricity and with sort of pseudoscientific accounts of evolution and magnetism all come into play. I think we get, particularly in the American version, I think the sort of European version is more explicitly sort of nihilistic, but this idea that there's some kind of force, some energy that runs through the universe that affects the outcome of our lives, that we are able to sort of tap into using our affective faculties, that we are able to kind of, our feelings help us get in touch with it and maybe shape it and maybe channel it. And I think that is, again, something that, regardless of what sort of religion you belong to, profess or don't profess, it's something that's become so normalized in how we talk in contemporary American culture. Whether we're talking, offhand about bad vibes or good energy, or like over 50% of Americans say they believe in manifesting. Right, sort of an informal poll of people in this age range has revealed this is sort of not an unreasonable number. About 20% of Americans say they've tried it in order to attract certain things into their lives. And so I think that it has become a sort of normalized, sort of implicit metaphysical assumption at the background of a lot of our consciousness. But I also think that one of the sort of, and this goes back to your question earlier, it's difficult to tell how much of the creation of the harnessing of energy is distinguishable from the managing of public perception. And I'm thinking of something like Norman Vincent Peale, who writes in the New Thought tradition, The Power of Positive Thinking, where, are you harnessing the magical energy of the universe to give you success? Or are you ready, willing, and able to stretch the truth a little bit, to walk in a room with confidence and a handshake and get a bunch of people to give you money to invest in your company, and then so on and so forth? And so I think that there is a deep, slightly bleak nihilism, even in the kind of vibes-based religious sense, that where we find this actually playing out, where we find the kind of think positive and dream big and talk big and maybe stretch the truth a little bit, and is in the realm of the people who are able to shape public perception, sometimes by outright lying, are able to create, if not the truth, a shared social reality with actual political and real world ramifications.
I have nothing as intellectual as any of the professors asked, but I've been trying to understand the idea of self-making within, say, our modern political context of the existing system. And it appears to me that if you kind of view it as a spectrum from right to left, there is more of a comfort with the idea of self-making in a traditional socioeconomic private entrepreneurship itself on the right, versus a comfort with the living your life as a work of art and kind of flexible, creative self-making more towards the left. And I'm trying to understand if the understandings of truth as being internalized versus transcendental and more traditional religious framework also fits within that understanding. Does this seem to make sense in how you're studied and understood self-thinking?
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely let's say elements of what I would consider contemporary self-making ideology that are more or less present in sort of left and right versions of it. Stresses on certain kinds of human freedom in one regard, and stresses on certain kinds of human industriousness on the other. But I think that sort of both of them are working with certain sets of assumptions that like they're working within the same framework of assumptions. But I think it's also fair to say, and I think this is true in my response to your question about Bronze Age pervert, and I want to make clear that this is not any kind of moral equivalence, but I think you can also see in perhaps what is often referred to as the social justice left, a real good faith attempt to say there's something about what we do not choose that is really important to who we are, and we're gonna work out to figure out how to work that into a political discussion. And again, I do not make any other equivalents except to say it is clear that I think there is a sort of increasing, particularly among younger people, discontent with the idea that givenness is not as much a part, at least in America, of our contemporary discourse, but perhaps a less clear-cut sense of what to do about it or how that should play out. And that's sort of given rise, in my view, to a lot of sort of discourse and tension and uncertainty of there is something that is missing, and we're not quite sure how to incorporate it into a shared civic life. Thanks.
I was wondering about one question that we seem to be dancing around is the question of our age, which is authenticity. And so I was wondering about if you could talk about authenticity, if it's even possible, and perhaps the tension between being authentic, or I guess being yourself, and not being antagonistic to or opposed to mainstream commercial popular culture. And so in that way, what is that tension kind of doing? And like I was kind of wondering about that in relation to self-making as well.
So personally, I don't like the concept of authenticity, or I think that authenticity doesn't really exist. I think it's a kind of a concept that points to something, but ends up getting sort of bogged down in, what does it mean to be authentic, especially, it seems to mean being true to a certain conception of oneself, but that conception of oneself, I think we've a couple of questions have touched on this, is not kind of intrinsic or internally shaped. That just to be authentic to oneself seems to often boil down to be true to particular desires that may or may not be quote unquote authentic. So I think it's like perhaps a fool's errand to go to talk about authenticity. But I do think that you are onto something, which is like a great sort of thinking in a Kierkegaardian way. How do we be who we are? How do we understand ourselves, and how do we express that? And I think that what I don't want to do in being wary of authenticity, or being wary of certain kind of visions of self-expression as being the totality of us, I don't want to lose the fact that I think it's something that we as communicative beings, as social animals do, is we do try and constantly sometimes I think every word that we say is an attempt to express what we are to be known and to be recognized and often, perhaps for the wrong reasons. Perhaps we're, always humble bragging because we want people to think we're successful, or perhaps we're, putting on makeup to be seen a certain way. But I think many of our acts, maybe all of our acts, I probably would say all of our acts, are in part kind of an invitation to be recognized, which is, I think, made all the more complicated by the fact that I think we don't really know who we are. No one knows who we are. Like that is one of the great unknowable questions of being a human being. And I think that rather than try and seeking authenticity, I think kind of recognition that self-knowledge is maybe sort of asymptotic, that we never fully attain it, is and because we can never fully attain it, we can never fully be authentic, feels I don't know, it helps keep me more sane.
Maybe time for one more. Last question?
One more.
Yeah, go for it.
So one text that we read together is Frankenstein, and which is not exactly self-making, but it's pretty close. Could you talk about Frankenstein a little bit?
Sure. Well, what I think is so interesting is both Frankenstein and kind of science fiction has often been this really interesting realm of exploring kind of, not, as you say, self-creation, but the creation of an imagined other, artistic and technological alike, as being, all right, what makes us us, and a deep discomfort with what it means to be a human being who is a creator. My specialty is not here, Frankenstein specifically, but later in the 19th century, there's a whole, I don't know if you know Tomorrow's Eve by Auguste Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. Did my doctoral thesis on him, and I still can't say his name right. But these, there's this incredible corpus of texts about the making of the other being this kind of the question of what it means to be modern. That how do you tell what it is to be a real person from being a not real person, or being a kind of other being that is not fully human? And I think that I would frame that as a question about, I mean, I'm a theologian. They're all nails, it's a hammer. But in a world that seems to have a less of a guarantee, I am someone with a soul. I am made in the image and the image and likeness of God. I have this way of understanding myself as distinct and sacred and special. There become this whole host of ways of self-understanding oneself as sacred and special and distinct and not a fake person, and creating a fake person becomes one of the means that you kind of show that you're not one. Everyone should read Tomorrow's Eve. It's a weird book. Thomas Edison is a character in it. I think there's a New English translation of it. So it's either Tomorrow's Eve or Eve of the Future. It depends on the translation. Highly recommend it.
Okay, well, now that we have arrived at creating monsters, I think we've come to the end of the conversation for today. So thank you very much.